In this video, we're going to begin talking about questionnaire design. Before beginning your survey, you should take time to consider, is this project enhanced by a survey? What is the goal of your research project? What is the goal of the survey portion of your research project? Who will be taking the survey, and in what format will it be administered? By carefully thinking through these questions, you can make better decisions. Is the project enhanced by survey data? If not, then you shouldn't be doing a survey. If you require detailed information about a small group of people, then a survey probably isn't what you want. Interviews would serve you much better. Now, if you are going to do a survey, is it the primary piece of the research project, or is it designed to augment other parts of your research project? Remember, anything you ask on a survey should be asked in a way that's appropriate for surveys or gives you reasonable data. Tell me about your childhood is a terrible survey question. How will you code it? What will it mean? That may be a good interview question, but it would be a very difficult one on a survey. In what city were you born? While this seems like it might work well as a survey question, think about the fact that if someone is born in a smaller city, there might be lots of cities with the same name. How will you distinguish between them? Indicate your level of support from strongly opposed to strongly support for Proposition Q, which makes it illegal to place strip clubs, sex shops, or distributors of pornography within 100 yards of a public school. That's something most people could answer on a survey and would provide you with detailed comparative data. Remember, the goal of the project drives the development of your survey. What you need to test your model and augment the findings is what goes into your survey. Everything else should be eliminated. Extra data is enticing, but it's not cost efficient. Moreover, the additional length it adds to your survey will lower your response rates. When designing your questionnaire, you should think about who's going to be taking the survey. Who is the intended sample? Does it make sense given your research question? Is it realistic? Will you have enough of people in different categories for you to be able to test the hypotheses you want to test? Are there any special considerations you need to consider? Does it require a particular level of language? Does it need to be below a certain point? Will you need translations into other languages? Is the mode of delivery appropriate? If you want to survey senior citizens, perhaps smartphone app as your primary mode of delivery isn't the best choice. The format and the mode of delivery are interrelated. Will the people be taking the survey in person? Will it be written or verbal? Will it be an interview? Will it be taken online? Will it be mailed to respondents? All of these things will affect how you should construct your survey, the amount of instructions you'll need, and so forth. The content of the survey is guided by the variables involved in your study. For each hypothesis, you will have at least two variables requiring at least two survey questions to measure those variables. Some variables may also be measured for context. So to begin, you want to identify what are the variables in your hypothesis and how should you measure those. A variable is a concept made measurable. You've taken some idea, age, income, patriotism, and you've measured it in some way. Its value can change respondent to respondent. The answer categories reveal how you expect it to change. So if you were to ask for ethnicity, you would probably have a standard range of answer categories such as Asian American, African American, Caucasian, white, Latino, Native American, other, multi-ethnic, and so forth. A constant has only one value. If you were to go to a women's only college and ask for gender, it should be a constant in that sample. Operationalization is the process of taking a concept and making it into a variable. This might be something very simple. You want to measure gender. You might ask people simply to self-report their gender as male, female, or other on the survey. Just take a self-report. That's a very easy operationalization. On the other hand, there's things like political ideology that are much more complicated. You might want to ask several questions about political ideology and combine them into a scale to measure it. In order to operationalize a variable, what you have to ask yourself is, what are the components of this variable, and how would I measure them in a survey format? In different types of studies, variables may be operationalized in different ways, but since this class is survey research, you should be operationalizing your variables through answers to survey questions. Let's take an example. Let's say you hypothesize that women are more politically liberal than men. This would be supported by a lot of the literature. You have two concepts here that you need to operationalize: gender and political orientation as liberal, moderate, or conservative. In this example, as I already stated, gender is fairly straightforward. We would probably just ask for a self-report of the person as male, female, or other. Measuring liberalism and conservatism poses a much greater challenge. For example, do I mean social, political, or economic liberalism and conservatism? In this example, I'm going to focus on economic liberalism, conservatism. Traditionally, when we measure things like this, we would go and use an existing scale. That's usually a series of items that people would respond to that are already known to measure a particular concept. In fact, when the Empire group here at Cal Poly Pomona was faced with just such a challenge, that's exactly what we did. Here's a series of items that came off our economic liberalism and conservatism scale. The minimum wage should be increased. Tax cuts stimulate economic growth. Welfare hurts the economy by making people less willing to work. People with more money should be taxed at a higher rate than those with less. Regulation of business has hurt the economy. Take a moment to think about how your answer to the level of agreement with each of these statements might track with economic liberalism or conservatism. Your degree would help us identify whether or not you should fall in the middle as a moderate. Since we're talking about variables, I'd like to mention a few other things that are important to your model. The idea of dependent and independent variables, latent and indicator variables, mediators, and moderators. We won't be able to go into too much detail on some of these things in the class, but I just wanted to make you aware of them, especially since you'll be reading a lot of studies in the upcoming weeks. Some hypotheses have clear dependent and independent variables. A dependent variable is one in which its variability is impacted by the independent variable. It's the variable being acted upon. The independent variable is your cause or explanation of the change in the value of the dependent variable. Now, some might argue, can you truly have an independent or dependent variable if you don't have an experimental design? An experimental psychologist would probably say no. On the other hand, I think in this example, it's sort of hard to argue that one's political orientation impacted his or her gender. Latent variables emerge from concept formulation. Essentially, they're variables that are difficult to measure directly, but we measure indirectly through other related variables. For example, quality of life is a good example of a latent variable. It's difficult to measure directly, but we can measure lots of different components that we combine to create a new variable, quality of life. The indicator variables, or the manifest variables, are the concrete, measurable things used to collect data. For example, if quality of life is our latent variable, it's made manifest with things like income, employment, mental and physical health, and so forth. A mediator is something coming between an independent and a dependent variable that's actually the cause. For example, if cultural capital leads to educational capital, which leads to post-secondary degrees, cultural capital leading to post-secondary degrees is being mediated by educational capital. What that indicates is the relationship is more complicated than simply saying cultural capital leads to educational capital. Without that intermediary step, the last step might not occur. Variables as moderators. Moderators are not the cause of something, but they're interacting with other variables. In a previous class, students looked at social media usage. Some students hypothesized that there was a relationship between social media usage and self-esteem. What we found was that there was a relationship between social media usage and self-esteem for the women in our sample, but not the men. In this case, gender is acting as a moderator. Moderator variables limit when something occurs. Mediators are more of an explanation as to why something occurred. Moderators will influence the strength of a relationship between two other variables. A mediator explains why that relationship exists. When preparing your survey, you want to manage the length. The longer the survey, the worse the response rates. Of course, you also don't want to forget to ask something that's going to be crucial to your study later. Be sure every question on the survey has a clear purpose, but also be sure that you're asking for everything you really need. Prior to sending out your questionnaire, you need to think through how you're going to protect the anonymity and/or confidentiality of your subjects. For example, when I set up our SurveyMonkey account for this project, I'll be setting it up so that we won't even know the IP address of where the survey is coming from. In many surveys, you might have a pre or a post test, or you might be matching up who is returning the survey. In this case, you have to say that you can only provide confidentiality. You need to take clear steps to protect the confidentiality of everyone filling out that survey. If your respondents doubt that there's the anonymity or the confidentiality of the research, they will not be honest when they fill out the survey. Response bias is a problem in survey research. Response bias is the idea that those who agree to participate are qualitatively different from those who refuse. There's no way to measure or estimate response bias. That's the whole problem. Consider factors in your survey that may increase or decrease response bias. Is there anything you can do to try to mitigate this? If you're going to be measuring something that's been measured before, using existing measures and scales and citing them is best practice. This is part of why you want to do the literature review early. If someone's already measured something well, why not emulate their findings? Obviously, on our class survey, we won't be able to fit a full index or scale coming from a large survey. However, we could select several items. For example, when students have wanted to measure self-esteem, they've generally selected 5 or 6 items from the Rosenberg self-esteem scale.